Hi and welcome back to Gen Z Bible
class.
We are going to continue on, and actually I think we're going to finish Genesis chapter 7 as we look at the story of Noah and the ark and all the things that were going on then. It's interesting, this part, the second half of this chapter it turns out to be very repetitive. A lot of the things said again and again. And I guess maybe the point is trying to be made here because of that repetition. And again, remember we were talking about how Moses, who records all of this, gets all this information, and a lot of it was oral tradition and some of it could have been written down. So it seems like he's trying to sew together a total story from a bunch of little bits and pieces of what he knows. But at any rate, we're going to take a look at it, and we're going to start in by picking up where we left off. Genesis chapter 7, verses 10 through 12. After the 7 days, the flood waters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were open, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So a couple of interesting things, and I guess in a way we could say new information that we haven't heard before, that it mentions a specific date on the 17th day of the second month. Now, this would have related to the Jewish calendar, and that was a lunar calendar. It doesn't quite line up with our solar calendar that we use today, but it's interesting because it reminds us, I guess, that there were a lot of things going on in the pre-flood world that we're not quite sure of, but we do know that this tradition of, well, first of all, the tradition of sacrifice, that goes way back to Adam, and the idea of keeping, understanding that some foods were clean and some foods were unclean, that also was something that was a part of their understanding, the pre-flood world. Of course, that's something that gets embellished a lot further down the line in Moses and the teaching of Moses and the laws, but some of those things go back to this time, including this calendar system. And we know that they were keeping track of time because when we were looking at the genealogies, it was so-and-so lived so many years, and you add that to his kid who lived so many years, and you can kind of figure out a timeline. So that's how we know that pre-flood period was about 650 years, give or take. So we're able to pinpoint a date on the calendar. But the other interesting thing about that is it happens to be that second month would have fallen in the springtime of the year. And, just think about planning ahead a little bit. They're on the ark for 7 days, and then the flood comes. They're on the ark for, they watch the rain fall for 40 days. After 150 days, the flood waters go away, but they're still on the ark for another half a year. In other words, they're on the ark for a year plus 10 days, if I did my math right. And what that means is that when they came out of the ark, it would have been springtime. You go into the ark, you're on there for a year, and suddenly it's springtime. And what better time to come off the ark than springtime, because you've got all those seeds to plant, and they need a season to grow in. So all of this to say that God knows what he's doing, and that all of this was done in a logical and orderly way. So the new world begins in the springtime. A couple of other things that are mentioned here, and a lot of people wonder, the earth was covered with water, and how could that be? I mean, there's not enough rain in the skies to cover the earth with water. But there's another source of water that's mentioned here, and that is the fountains of the deep. So you've got these two water sources, and a lot of people believe that there were subterranean sources of water that would come up, that this was a time of huge turmoil. And it wasn't just, rain, building up, but there was all kinds of things going on with the tectonic plates moving around and mountains being lifted up and just the whole face of the earth being rearranged and the continents that we have now being formed. So all kinds of stuff was going on, and that might help us to understand when the Bible says that the whole earth was covered with water, that it really could have been covered with water. We know that there was this great vault of water that is mentioned in Genesis 1, where God created the earth, and he separated it from the vault under, below and the vault of water above. So there was plenty of water to work with. Now, let's continue on, verses 13 and 14. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. And they had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kind, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind. So it's interesting. Before, last week we had these 3 categories of animals. There were 7 pairs of clean animals, 2 pairs of unclean animals, and then 7 pairs of all the birds. So, there were 3 different categories of animals. Here we have 4 different categories of animals. So it sort of helps us to expand our picture of what was going on. First of all, it mentions wild animals. I think we all know what a wild animal is. Domestic animals, your goats and your sheep and your cows and all that kind of stuff. Creeping animals. What is a creeping animal? Well, maybe like snakes and reptiles and maybe all the bugs that creep. You know what creeps and what doesn't. And then mentions the birds once again. I think God had a special love for birds. I know I do. I like to go around taking pictures of birds all the time. But those are the categories. So again, it just clarifies the picture of what was going on and, the different animals that were there. But another thing we see is this phrase, on that day. That this was a day that was ordained by God. Now, we know that God told Noah that this stuff was going to happen. But we also get the sense that there was an appointed day that God knew when this was going to happen. And we got a little hint of that back in Genesis chapter 6 when we were looking at the genealogies, and God was talking about all the things that were going on. And he said that my spirit, in Genesis 6:3, will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. So what does that mean, 120? Does that mean people are going to stop living for 900 years like Adam did, and they're only going to live 120 years? But a lot of other people feel what that was saying is that at that point, when God made that statement, 120 years, that he was referring to the time of the flood, and that he was saying that mankind is only going to have 120 years from that particular point on, wherever he made that statement, until the time of the flood. So the whole point is, it was God's appointed time on that very day. And we can extend that a little bit when we think of the fact that there is another day, appointed day of judgment, that is yet to come. And when we see that God kept his word on that whole first promise about his day of judgment, we know that he's going to keep his word on this next day of judgment that is talked about in the Bible. Where do we read that? Well, that's in Matthew 24. And this is a portion of Scripture where Jesus is saying a lot of prophetic things. He's talking about the future, and he's telling us things that are going to happen in the future. And this is what he says. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it is written, in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they were oblivious until the flood came and swept them all away. So it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. And so God knew the day he was going to send that flood. And it says the Father knows the day of the coming judgment, this coming day of the Lord. And so I think that's something to appreciate and keep in mind, the fact that God gives us this information, and I guess in a way gives us a warning of what is to come. And fortunately, he provides also for us a way to escape this next judgment that's going to come, as we mentioned last time. Well, let's continue on in Genesis 7:15 to 16. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God commanded Noah. And then the Lord shut him in. Well, a few things here to pay attention to. One of them was that the animals were directed there by God. You know, it wasn't like we were kind of joking about it last week. These animals came to Noah. Noah didn't have to go out and try to catch them. And we used the image of him, you know, running around trying to catch a kangaroo, which I'm sure nobody would want to do. And would have been impossible for Noah to make that all happen. So this was something that we acknowledge that God did himself. So that's very clear from this verse. And it also uses this phrase, the breath, everything with the breath of life. Of course, we know, well, fish do breathe. I mean, they get oxygen through their gills, but they didn't have like lungs like we do, as many animals do. In other words, they get along fine in the water, so we didn't have to worry about the fish. But these were all the creatures on the ark that really could not have survived otherwise. All these creatures with the breath of life. That's kind of an interesting phrase, the breath of life. God used that same phrase in Genesis 2:7 when he talked about breathing the breath of life into Adam and making him a living being. But also there's an interesting verse in Job 12:10. In his hand, in the hands of God, is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. You know, think about that. God holds our lives in his hand. Every breath that we take is a gift from God. But it also kind of gives us a picture of what was going on then. Every living creature that could breathe was there in that little ark. I mean, little in the sense when you compare it to this whole big ocean that it was floating on. Every bit of life that had breath in it was on that one little boat. I think we figured 10,000 square feet. Well, you know, that's fairly big. And we could almost figure out, you can figure out how all those animals could fit on there, technically speaking. But just the idea that at that time in the history of the world, every living, breathing thing was on that ark. The other thing is, another phrase within that verse we just read, the Lord shut the door. A couple of things come to my mind when I think about that. One is, I'm glad that he did. If I was Noah, I would have been very glad that God shut the door because, you know, I don't know what kind of door system they had. Obviously, there had to be a door for the animals to get in and Noah and his family. But the fact that God shut the door would give me a certain amount of confidence to know that that door was going to hold. I'm thinking structurally that would have been the weakest point in the whole ark. And if Noah had simply pulled it shut and, you know, locked the door, I don't know if I would have been confident in that. But when it says that God shut the door, maybe he put another extra coat of pitch on it and just, you know, made it impervious to opening or closing. I'm not sure. But the other thing that comes to mind when it says that God closed the door, I'm picturing something like a space capsule. And these astronauts get on there and, you know, they get all buckled in and these guys from the outside will crank that big wheel, you know, and lock them all in. So what that's saying to me is once that happens, there's no getting off. And I don't know if you've ever been on a roller coaster and you've decided, I'm going to go on this ride, and you get there and you sit in the seat, and then at a certain point, all these things come and lock you in, and you realize there's no getting out of this. There's no going back from this point on. Continuing, verses 17 and 19. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. Again, you get back to that question, well, how could the mountains all be covered? But when we think of the fact that places like Mount Everest probably didn't even exist back then because of all this activity, and we have mountains being lifted up during this whole flood process. We have all these fossilized animals being covered up in these sedimentary rocks, and all this stuff was going on at the same time. But where was Noah during all of this and his family? They were being lifted up above all of that, all the volcanic activity, and it's all this stuff that was going on that would have been impossible to survive. I think that's a good picture of, God lifts up Noah above all this turmoil, that there'll come a day when he will lift us up out of this earth, out of this trouble, and bring us to be with himself. It's kind of a picture of his coming in the day of the rapture that's promised in the Bible. So let's continue now, and we're getting close to the end here. And again, a lot of this is kind of repetitive, but we'll continue on. Verses 20 and 21. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. I mean, the Bible just goes on and on. It makes it so clear. Everything died. It leaves no question. It's very repetitive in that sense. But here, one more thing is added, and there's this measurement at 15 cubits, which is about 21 feet, which means, like, if you were a giraffe and you were treading water, your feet would not reach the closest mountain, the closest land. So even a giraffe would not have been able to survive 21 feet of water over the only thing that you might be able to stand on. It's just making it clear, abundantly clear, that nothing survived apart from those who were on this boat. But the other thing is, you remember how we were talking about all those names and genealogies, and why, if this was a book of fiction, you wouldn't need all that stuff? Well, here's another, it's just a incidental number that's thrown in there, but what it means is this is, again, it's not a fairy tale. We don't know exactly how this number was determined. I don't know if Noah, threw a line out and, took measurements when he was in the ark. But the fact that it mentions specifically this 15 cubits above all the mountains means to me that this is history. It's not fiction. That this is something that really happened. So, we're almost to the end. We got three more verses here to read. So we'll start at 22 and read on to the end. Everything on dry land that had breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. And again, this is so redundant, but people and animals and creatures that moved along the ground and birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him on the ark. Waters flooded the earth for 150 days. What do you conclude from all this? What did we learn from this portion of the story? Well, for one thing, God's judgment was predicted. He knew it was going to happen, and he knew when it was going to happen. To the very day, on that day, God did what he said he was going to do. We also know, as we've heard again and again and again, that this judgment was complete. That everything died. I mean, this was restated just in almost every single verse we just read. So that point was made clear. And where do we want to end? I'm going to read this verse that we I think this might be the third time we've read it, but it's pertinent because it talks about this situation with Noah, and it talks about how God did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but he protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. I guess in a nutshell, that really describes what this whole flood thing was about. That God did pronounce judgment on the world. He carried out that judgment, but he saved. He kept this remnant of life that would go on to repopulate the world. And as we always do, we want to end with a good word. And we can continue on, go down a little bit farther in this book of 2 Peter, the verse we just read from 2:2, and go down to chapter 3 in verse 13. But in keeping with his promise, this is our good word for the day, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. And, this is going to be a wonderful experience. I think of my days on the farm, and I kind of got a picture of this when we would keep the cows in the barn all winter long, and in the spring they would be let loose, but especially those little calves that were born sometime in the winter, and they had never been outside before. And when they opened the doors, and of course it's springtime, and that's what it would have been like for Noah getting off the ark. These little calves just went berserk. I mean, they were jumping around and running and acting totally unlike cows usually act. But that kind of gives a picture to me of what it will be like when we enter this new heaven and earth that God has prepared for us. But I'm going to have one more word, and this is more of an instructive word. And it's also from 2 Peter and verses 11 and 12. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? And then he answers that question. You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. I think that does really help us put this whole thing in perspective when we think of the fact that we saw what God did back then, and what he said, he did, and what he said is going to happen, he will do. But he has made a way of escape, as the Bible says, for us, so that we don't have to worry about going through this next judgment that is to come. So I hope this has been an encouragement to you, and I hope it's more than just these stories from the Old Testament, but we see these universal principles about who God is and what he has done for us, and we can apply that to our own lives. So next time we're going to be looking at Noah getting off the ark and some of the things that happened then, and I really hope that you will join us. I'm thinking of you guys and praying for you, and hope to see you again next time on Gen Z Bible class.